There is a city beneath your city, not a metaphor, not a theory, built from imagination and late nights and too much coffee. A literal, buried, documented city that exists under the streets of Boston, Massachusetts. Right now, as you listen to this, streets that were once at ground level are now 15, 20, sometimes 30 feet below the surface. Buildings that were fully standing, fully functioning, fully inhabited are now underground. Foundations that were built for sunlight are now surrounded by soil and stone and silence. Boston has one of the most aggressively documented cases of urban burial in the entire Western world. The evidence is not hidden. It is sitting in city archives, in engineering reports, in old photographs, in the testimony of workers who broke ground in the 19th century and found, to their shock, that the ground had already been broken before. What you are about to hear will take 2 hours to fully lay out, and when it is done, you will understand something that mainstream history has either overlooked or chosen not to prioritize. You will understand that the city of Boston, as we know it today, was not built on empty land. It was built on top of something else, something that came before, something that was already there. And the most unsettling part is not what is buried. The most unsettling part is how it got that way. If you are settling in for the night, find your comfortable position now. This story moves slowly and deliberately, the way that all honest investigations must. There is no need to rush. The buried city of Boston has been waiting for a very long time. It can wait a little longer while you get comfortable. Take a breath. Let your body relax. And listen. If you find value in this kind of deep historical exploration, the kind that goes past the textbook version of events and sits with the questions that mainstream sources prefer to leave unanswered, subscribe now. New sleep documentaries like this one arrive every week, and each one goes somewhere the standard history curriculum never bothered to look. Now, let us begin at the beginning. Or rather, let us begin at the beginning of what we can confirm and work our way carefully toward what we can only observe and wonder about. Boston was officially founded in 1630 by a group of Puritan settlers led by John Winthrop. This is the standard account. The Massachusetts Bay Colony established itself on a peninsula called Shawmut, a name given by the Massachusetts people who had lived in that region for thousands of years before any European ship appeared on the horizon. The settlers found the peninsula suitable for their purposes. It had fresh water, it had natural harbour access. It had a series of hills that provided defensible high ground. What the settlers also found, though history tends to gloss over this part, was evidence that the land had been used before. The Massachusetts people had not simply wandered through this peninsula. They had pathways worn into it. They had cleared areas. They had, in the estimation of several early colonial writers whose journals survive to this day, established a relationship with this particular piece of land that implied generations of continuous use. This is not unusual. Indigenous peoples throughout North America had relationships with the land that European settlers consistently underestimated or ignored. But in the case of Boston, there is something worth pausing on. The peninsula of Shawmut before colonial settlement had a particular topography. It had hills, it had valleys, it had a landscape that was shaped by whatever forces, natural or otherwise, had acted upon it before human memory began recording things in the formats we now consider reliable. The three main hills of the original Shawmut Peninsula were called Tri-Mountain by the early English settlers, Beacon Hill, Cotton Hill, and Mount Vernon. These three hills were substantial. Beacon Hill, the one that survives in reduced form today, originally stood at around 60 feet above sea level. The others were comparable. Together, they gave the peninsula a dramatic, elevated character that early drawings and paintings of colonial Boston consistently capture. Those hills are mostly gone now, not because of natural erosion, not because of volcanic activity or tectonic shifts or the slow grinding work of geological time. They are gone because the city of Boston, beginning in the early 19th century and continuing for roughly 100 years, systematically cut them down and used the fill to extend the city into the surrounding harbour and mudflats. This is documented. This is not disputed. The process is called the Boston Hill Cutting Projects, and it is one of the most dramatic examples of deliberate urban earth-moving in American history. Millions of cubic yards of earth were removed from the original hills and used to create new land where there had previously been water or tidal marsh. Here is where it gets interesting. When the workers began cutting into these hills, they did not find only soil and rock. They found things that raised questions, things that were recorded in some accounts and quietly set aside in others, things that, when you look at them in aggregate, begin to tell a different story than the one the standard historical account provides. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what was found, you first need to understand the broader context. You need to understand the pattern, because Boston is not alone in this. Across the entire eastern seaboard of North America, and then extending westward across the continent as the great expansion of the 19th century pushed settlement into previously unexplored territory, the same phenomenon appears with a consistency that demands explanation. Cities and towns being built, and workers finding, beneath the surface, evidence of prior occupation, evidence of prior construction, evidence that the land was not empty before European settlement, but was instead carrying the remains of something that came before. The academic explanation for this is layered occupation. The idea is straightforward. Human beings have been living in favorable locations for thousands of years. Earlier settlements decompose and become part of the ground. Later settlements are built on top. This is how archaeological layers work. You dig down and you find older things the deeper you go. The Romans built on top of earlier peoples. Medieval Europeans built on top of the Romans. This is normal. This is expected. But the researchers and independent historians who study what is sometimes called the Tartaria hypothesis, or the mudflood theory, or simply the hidden history of the world, point out something that the standard layered occupation explanation does not fully address. They point to a specific pattern, a specific type of burial, a specific set of characteristics that appear in city after city, in context after context. That suggests not the gradual accumulation of layers over thousands of years, but something faster, something more sudden, something that happened within a relatively short and recent window of time. The pattern looks like this: buildings that are clearly built in a sophisticated architectural style, using methods that require skilled labor, fine materials, and significant investment, appear to be partially or entirely below grade. Their lower floors are underground. Their windows, which were clearly designed to admit light, face into earth or brick rather than open air. Their entrances, which were clearly designed as primary access points, are now reached by descending rather than ascending. In Boston, this pattern is everywhere. And we mean everywhere, not in one district, not in one era of construction. Across the city, across multiple neighborhoods, across the span of what historians present as 200 years of normal urban development, the buildings sit lower than they should. The streets sit higher than the buildings. The grade relationships are wrong in a way that the standard explanations struggle to account for. Let us walk through this carefully. Beacon Hill today is a neighborhood of elegant Federal and Greek Revival architecture. Red brick row houses, gas lamps, cobblestone streets. It is one of the most picturesque and carefully preserved urban neighborhoods in the United States. Tourists come from around the world to walk its narrow streets and admire its architecture. If you walk those streets and look carefully at the buildings, you will notice something. Many of them have what appear to be basement windows and basement entrances that are actually at or near what should be ground level. The parlor floors, which in federal-style architecture were intended to be the primary living floors, are elevated above the street, but the elevation does not always match the intended design. In some buildings, what was clearly designed as a ground floor entrance is now accessed from a staircase that descends from the sidewalk level. This is explained by historians as a simple matter of street raising. As Boston expanded and developed through the 19th century, street levels were raised repeatedly to improve drainage and accommodate infrastructure improvements. This is true. Street levels in Boston were raised. The documentation exists. But here is the question that the mudflood researchers ask. Why were the streets raised? And why were they raised to the degree they were? And why, if the raising was a gradual process of incremental improvement, does the degree of burial seem so consistent and so uniform across such a wide geographic area? The answer that official history provides is practical engineering. Boston sits on a peninsula with relatively poor natural drainage. Before modern sewer systems, the streets flooded regularly. Raising them was a matter of public health and infrastructure necessity. The fill was readily available from the hill-cutting projects. The combination of need and available material made the street-raising program logical and economical. This explanation is not wrong, but the mudflood researchers argue that it is incomplete. They argue that it explains what happened in a technical sense without explaining what triggered the need for it. They argue that the scale of the street raising, the sheer volume of material moved, and the degree of elevation change achieved points toward a baseline condition that required correction rather than a gradual process of refinement. In other words, something happened, something that left the city at the wrong level, and the street-raising programs were the response to that something, not the cause. The response. What was that something? This is where the story leaves the comfort of documented history and enters the territory that mainstream academic discourse prefers not to occupy. This is where the sleep documentary format serves a particular purpose. Because the ideas we are about to discuss require a certain kind of receptivity, a willingness to sit with uncertainty, a willingness to consider possibilities that have not been officially endorsed. We are not asking you to believe anything. We are asking you to listen, to consider, to hold the questions open. The mudflood hypothesis, in its most basic form, proposes that sometime in the relatively recent past, within the last several centuries, and possibly as recently as the early 19th century, a catastrophic event occurred that affected large portions of the inhabited world. This event involved a massive movement of water and sediment, a flood on a scale that would have been civilization-altering, that buried the lower portions of existing cities and settlements under a layer of mud and debris. The settlements that survived, or that were rebuilt afterward, did so on top of this deposited layer. The buildings and streets of the previous civilization were not demolished and replaced. They were simply buried. They were left in place, covered over, and the next civilization built on top of them without fully understanding or without choosing to record what was underneath. This theory has significant problems when viewed through a strict evidentiary lens. The primary problem is the absence of any clear historical record of such an event. A flood that buried large portions of the world's cities would be, by any reasonable measure, the most significant event in recorded human history. It would appear in every surviving historical document. It would be the central fact of every culture's collective memory. Proponents of the theory have responses to this objection. Some argue that the historical record was deliberately altered or suppressed, that whoever controlled the institutions of knowledge in the aftermath of the event had reasons to obscure it. Some argue that the event is encoded in historical accounts, but under different names and in different frameworks. The flood narratives that appear in hundreds of cultures around the world, the accounts of lost civilizations and sunken cities, the persistent myths of a golden age that ended in catastrophe. Others argue that the timeline of the event is the key, that if the mud flood occurred during what historians call the early modern period, roughly the 16th through early 19th centuries, then the suppression of the record would have been more feasible than if it had occurred in deep antiquity. The institutions of the modern world, universities, governments, churches, were already in place and already had the organizational capacity to shape what the historical record would say. We are not adjudicating these arguments tonight. We are laying them out. We are presenting the terrain. What we can say with confidence, because the evidence is physical and documented and observable, is this. In Boston, as in many cities around the world, there is a consistent pattern of structures that appear to be buried below their original grade. This pattern is not fully explained by the accepted historical accounts of gradual urban development, and the questions it raises are legitimate questions, worthy of serious attention, even if the most dramatic explanations for the pattern remain unproven. So let us go deeper. Let us look at the specific evidence. Let us walk through the buried city of Boston, layer by layer, and see what is actually there. The first layer to examine is the most literal, the physical layer of burial that is visible in the city's oldest neighborhoods. In the North End, which is one of Boston's oldest continuously occupied neighborhoods and the site of the most intense early colonial settlement, the street levels have been documented through engineering records to have risen by as much as 12 to 15 feet in some locations since the colonial period. This is not contested. The engineering records exist. The historical surveys exist. The degree of rise is established. 12 to 15 feet. Think about what that means in physical terms. If you were standing on the original colonial ground level of the North End, the modern street would be above your head. Not at your chest, not at your shoulders, above your head. You would be looking up at the undersides of modern vehicles. The world you knew would be underground. The buildings that were constructed at that colonial ground level, and whose foundations and lower portions therefore remain at that level, are now partially subterranean. Some of them have been excavated. Some of them have been incorporated into basements of later structures. Many of them are simply there, in the soil, unexcavated, waiting. The Paul Revere House, which is the oldest surviving structure in downtown Boston and one of the most visited historic sites in the country, sits in the North End. When you approach it, you walk down from the surrounding street level. The house appears to be in a kind of depression. This is presented to visitors as simply the character of the old house, its age and original construction, leaving it at a different grade than the modern surroundings. But the grade difference is real and substantial. The house is not sunken. The surrounding street is raised. The house sits at something much closer to its original grade. The street around it has risen. The Old South Meeting House, where colonial Bostonians gathered in 1773 to plan what would become the Boston Tea Party, shows a similar pattern. The building's original floor level and the modern exterior grade do not match in the way they should if the building had always sat in its current relationship to the surrounding terrain. The building appears to have been partially buried by successive street raisings, its lower register sitting lower than the grade relationships of the period in which it was built would suggest. This is not a dramatic claim. This is an observation about grade relationships that any civil engineer walking those streets would be able to confirm. The buildings and the streets do not relate to each other the way they would if both had been built at the same time on undisturbed ground. Now, the standard historical explanation is, again, the documented street raising programs of the 19th century, and this explanation is true as far as it goes. But there is another layer of this story that requires attention, because the street raising programs were not happening in isolation. They were happening in the context of the hill cutting projects, and both of those were happening in the context of something else, something that precedes both of them and that has received far less attention than it deserves. The filled land. A significant portion of the city of Boston, as it exists today, is not original land at all. It is fill. It is land that was created by dumping material into the harbour, the tidal flats, the marshes that surrounded the original Shawmut Peninsula. The Back Bay neighbourhood, one of the most elegant Victorian-era residential districts in the United States, sits entirely on fill. The South End, large portions of Charlestown, East Boston, the South Boston waterfront, all of these are on land that did not exist when the first colonial settlers arrived. The creation of filled land in Boston is a story that is well told in standard historical accounts. It was a massive engineering project. The numbers are staggering. The Back Bay alone required the filling of approximately 450 acres of tidal flats. This was accomplished primarily by train, with gravel being brought in from Needham, Massachusetts, at a rate of roughly 35 carloads per day, every day, for almost 40 years. Beginning in 1857 and continuing until around 1894, an area that had been open water and mudflats was transformed into solid urban land. That is the official account. And it is, in the main, accurate. But there is a detail in this account that the mudflood researchers point to with considerable interest. The material that was used to fill the Back Bay was not only gravel from Needham, it was also, according to the contemporary accounts of workers involved in the project, material that was already in the area, material that was being dredged from the harbour bottom, material that, when examined, contained within it artifacts and remnants that raised questions about its origin. Workers in the 19th century were not archaeologists. They were not trained to identify and document what they found in the earth. When they turned up things in the soil, things that seemed old, things that seemed out of place, the standard response was to note it and continue working. The project did not stop for artifacts. The project continued because the project had to continue. The city needed the land, but some workers wrote about what they found. Some foremen kept notes. Some newspaper reporters, and the penny press of the 19th century, was voracious in its appetite for interesting stories, wrote pieces about unusual discoveries made during the great filling and cutting projects of Boston. Those accounts describe, among other things, old timber structures encountered in the fill, stone foundations in locations where no structure was supposed to have stood, artifacts of European manufacture that appeared to be older than the oldest European presence in the region could account for, and, most intriguingly, evidence of what one contemporary account described as former habitation in areas that were supposed to have been open water within historical memory. These accounts are scattered, they are not comprehensive. They were written in the context of a 19th century press culture that did not always distinguish carefully between the factual and the sensational. They cannot, by themselves, serve as the foundation for a revision of standard historical understanding. But they are there. They are part of the record. And when you combine them with the physical evidence that is still visible in the city, the grade anomalies, the buried structures, the relationships between buildings and streets that do not quite add up, they contribute to a picture that is more complex than the standard textbook account suggests. Let your mind rest on that for a moment. The image of workers in the 19th century moving through the mud and fill of Boston Harbor, finding things, old things, things that should not have been there, setting them aside because the work must continue, and the city rising around them, covering those things over, building on top of what was already there. The night deepens, your breathing slows, the story continues. We need to go back further. We need to look at the period before the documented street raising programs. We need to look at what Boston was before the great 19th century transformation. And to do that, we need to look at the maps. The maps of colonial and early American Boston are extraordinary documents. They are detailed. They are, for their time, remarkably accurate. And they tell a story that, when you know what to look for, is deeply interesting. The Bonner map of 1722 is one of the earliest and most important maps of Boston. It shows the town as it existed in the early 18th century, when it was already a well-established colonial port of several thousand inhabitants. The map shows streets, buildings, wharves, the shoreline, the hills. When you compare the Bonner map to the modern street plan of Boston, two things become immediately apparent. The first is how much of the modern city street grid was already in place in 1722. The fundamental layout of the old core of the city, the North End, the area around the old State House, the neighborhoods along the harbor, reflects patterns that were established before the great 19th century transformation and that persist to this day. The second thing that becomes apparent is how dramatically the topography has changed. The hills that dominate the Bonner map are gone or diminished. The shoreline has moved substantially outward. The scale of physical transformation that took place between the Bonner map's world and the modern city is immense. But there is a third thing, a thing that takes longer to notice, a thing that requires spending time with the maps, comparing them carefully, measuring relationships. The buildings shown on the Bonner map and the various maps of the late 18th and early 19th century sit in grade relationships to their surrounding streets that are different from what you would expect if those streets had always been at their current levels. The ground floors of buildings shown in the maps, when traced through to their modern remnants or their documented locations, appear consistently lower than the modern street grade. This is what the historical record would predict, given the documented street raising programs, but the degree of burial, the consistency of it, and the spatial pattern of it suggest that the raising was not a simple, incremental process. It suggests that there was a baseline from which things departed at some specific moment, and that the subsequent raising was an attempt to correct for that departure. What created the baseline condition? What event or process left the streets at the wrong level in the first place? This is the question that the mud flood hypothesis attempts to answer. And whether or not you accept that answer, the question itself is legitimate. The grade anomalies are real, the buried structures are real. The gap between what the buildings suggest and what the maps show requires an explanation. The explanation that the standard historical account provides is, again, the gradual raising of streets over time for practical reasons. And again, this is true and documented. But the mud flood researchers argue that this explanation confuses cause and effect, that the raising was a response to something, not the thing itself. Let us consider the timeline more carefully. The most intensive period of street raising and landfilling in Boston occurred between roughly 1820 and 1900. This is the period for which the best documentation exists. This is the period that produced the most dramatic physical changes to the city's geography. But what was happening in Boston before 1820? What were the streets like? What was the relationship between building grade and street grade in the colonial and early federal period? This is where the historical record becomes sparse, not because the period is poorly documented overall. The colonial and revolutionary periods of Boston's history are among the most thoroughly documented in American history. But the specific question of grade relationships, of how buildings sat relative to streets, of what the topography looked like at the ground level of ordinary urban life, is not something that the surviving documents address directly. What we have instead are oblique references. Contemporary accounts that mention the difficulty of moving through the city after heavy rains. Descriptions of streets that were effectively impassable in wet weather. References to areas of the city that were chronically wet and muddy in ways that were not entirely explained by the proximity of the harbour. These are small details. They are not, by themselves, evidence of anything dramatic. Every city in the pre-modern era had drainage problems. Every city in the pre-modern era had streets that became muddy and impassable in rain. This was the universal condition of urban life before modern sewers and paved surfaces. But the mud flood researchers point out that the Boston accounts are qualitatively different from what you would expect for a city built on well-drained ground. They point out that the language used to describe the street conditions in early Boston is the language of chronic inundation rather than normal weather-related inconvenience. They point to specific accounts of sections of the city where the ground never fully dried, where the soil was perpetually waterlogged, where the construction of buildings required extraordinary measures to establish stable foundations. This is consistent with what you would expect to find in a city that had been partially buried by a mud deposit. Soil that had been laid down rapidly by flood action would be poorly compacted, poorly drained, and chronically wet for years or decades after the initial event. It would behave differently from naturally formed soil or from soil that had been deposited gradually over time. Is this what happened in Boston? We cannot say with certainty. We can say that the physical evidence is consistent with this interpretation. We can say that the standard explanation does not fully account for all of the observable phenomena. And we can say that the questions are worth asking. Your eyelids are heavy now. The city of Boston is somewhere outside these words, existing in the dark, its streets sitting above the buried world, its oldest buildings carrying the memory of a different grade, a different level, a different relationship to the ground. Beneath those streets, the buried city waits. 15 feet down in some places, 20 feet down in others. The remnants of what came before, the foundations of buildings that were never demolished, the artifacts that workers found and set aside, the answers to questions that the standard historical account has not fully addressed. We are going to spend the next several hours exploring this buried world. We are going to look at specific locations within Boston where the evidence is most compelling. We are going to examine the engineering records, the historical accounts, the visual evidence in the surviving architecture. We are going to sit with the questions and see what they tell us. But first, let your body settle a little more. Let the weight of the day release from your muscles. Let your breath come a little slower and a little deeper. There is no hurry. This story has been underground for a long time. It can wait for you to rest. We continue now with what is perhaps the most visually striking evidence of burial in the entire city of Boston. The phenomenon that researchers and curious visitors have been noting for decades, and that the official historical account has been slow to fully address. The sunken gardens of Beacon Hill. Along the south slope of Beacon Hill, which was developed as an elite residential neighborhood in the early 19th century, there exist a number of properties that feature what appear to be garden areas that are below the surrounding street level. These spaces, enclosed by the backs and sides of the surrounding row houses, form a kind of hidden landscape that is not visible from the street, but is clearly visible from the upper stories of the surrounding buildings. These below-grade garden areas have been explained as the result of the same street-raising processes that affected the rest of the city. The garden levels, in this account, represent the original grade, which was simply lower than the street level that developed around them over time. But there is something unusual about these spaces that goes beyond the simple grade relationship. The walls that surround them, the backs of the houses that face onto them, show evidence of being designed for a different grade relationship than the one that currently exists. Windows that should face onto a garden at one level appear to face onto the sunken area from a height that does not match the internal floor plan of the houses. Doorways that should be primary entrances appear to open onto the sunken area at a level that, from the interior of the houses, corresponds to basement or sub-basement space. In other words, the houses were not designed with the sunken garden below them. They were designed with the garden at a different level, a level that at some point became below, rather than at grade. The surrounding streets rose. The garden areas remained. The house designs, which reflect the original grade relationship, now appear anomalous because they are serving a relationship to the ground that no longer matches the original design intent. This is a subtle argument. It requires paying close attention to architectural detail. It requires some understanding of how Federal and Greek Revival houses were designed and how their floor plans relate to their exteriors. But for anyone who knows what to look for, the evidence is there. And it is not only on Beacon Hill. It appears throughout the neighbourhoods of the old city centre. In the South End, the long rows of bow-front Victorian brownstones, constructed primarily in the 1840s through 1870s, show a consistent pattern that has been noted by architectural historians, but not, in most cases, fully explained. The English basement houses of the South End, a building type in which the primary residential entry is below the piano nobile, below the formal parlour floor, were designed with the assumption that the English basement level would be at or slightly below the surrounding street grade. In many cases in the South End, this relationship is as expected. The English basement is accessed by descending a few steps from the sidewalk, exactly as intended. But in other cases, the relationship is wrong. The English basement level is significantly below the sidewalk grade, reached by descending a number of steps that the design does not clearly account for. The house design suggests one grade relationship. The actual street level suggests another. The explanation, again, is the street raising. But the pattern of which houses show this anomaly and which do not is not random. The anomaly is most pronounced in the areas that were filled earliest and in the areas that had the most documented history of drainage problems. This spatial pattern is consistent with an uneven underlying condition rather than a uniform engineering response. There is another category of evidence that we have not yet addressed. One that is perhaps more dramatic than the grade anomalies and the architectural details. The evidence that appears in the process of construction and renovation when workers break through the surface and find what is underneath. Boston is an old city that is constantly renovating itself. New subway lines cut through layers of urban history. Skyscraper foundations reach down through multiple strata of prior occupation. Water and sewer lines thread through soil that has never been fully inventoried. And in the process of all this digging, things are found. The Big Dig, the massive highway infrastructure project that rerouted Interstate 93 through a tunnel under downtown Boston, and that was one of the largest and most expensive infrastructure projects in American history, produced an extraordinary amount of archaeological data. The project required excavating large portions of the downtown waterfront area to depths that had never been systematically explored before. And what was found in that excavation challenged several assumptions about the early history of the site. The official archaeological record of the Big Dig has been published and is available to researchers. It is a substantial document. It records the discovery of numerous artifacts and structural remnants from various periods of Boston's history, ranging from the colonial era back through the pre-colonial period. The range of material found, and the depths at which various materials were found, presents a picture of layered occupation that is consistent with the overall narrative of long human presence at the site. But there are details within the Big Dig archaeological record that mudflood researchers have focused on with considerable interest. Specifically, the finding of timber structures and cultural material at depths that correspond to periods for which the accepted historical record provides no explanation. Material that appears to be of European manufacture, but was found at depths that predate the established timeline of European presence in the region. The official interpretation of these anomalies tends toward either misdating, the argument that the material is being incorrectly dated and is actually from a period consistent with the accepted timeline, or disturbance. The argument that material from later periods was carried downward into earlier strata through natural processes like root action or burrowing animals. These are legitimate interpretive approaches. They are used routinely in archaeology and are often the correct explanation for apparent anachronisms. But the mudflood researchers point out that these explanations are sometimes applied in a way that prioritizes the existing historical framework over the physical evidence, that the threshold for accepting anomalous evidence is set much higher than the threshold for accepting evidence that confirms existing assumptions, that the interpretive choices made by official archaeology are not purely objective, but are shaped by institutional commitments to particular historical narratives. This is a critique of academic practice that goes beyond the specific question of Boston's buried history. It is a critique that has been made by various researchers across various fields, and that has some merit as a general point about how knowledge institutions operate, even when the specific claims being advanced by the critics are not fully supported by the evidence. We are sitting in that space now, in the space between the official record and the anomalies that the official record does not fully address, in the space between the documented history of Boston and the physical evidence that raises questions the documented history has not answered. This is not a comfortable space. It is not a space that offers easy resolutions, but it is a real space, and it is worth spending time in. Let the discomfort be gentle. Let it be the kind of discomfort that comes from sitting with open questions rather than the kind that comes from panic or alarm. The buried city of Boston is not going anywhere. The questions it raises are not urgent in the sense of requiring immediate action. They are the kind of questions that a thoughtful person can sit with for a long time, returning to them periodically, turning them over, looking at them from different angles. That is what we are doing tonight. The next area of evidence to examine is perhaps the most contested and the most fascinating. It concerns the architectural style of certain buildings in Boston and what that style implies about when they were built and by whom. The Tartaria hypothesis, in its most expansive form, proposes not just that there was a catastrophic flood event in the relatively recent past, but that there was, before that event, a global civilization of considerable sophistication. A civilization that built in a consistent architectural style that appears across multiple continents and that has been attributed by standard historical accounts to various unconnected cultures and periods. This proposed civilization is often called Tartaria, a name derived from historical references to a vast and poorly defined territory in Central Asia that appeared on many European maps from the medieval through the early modern period. The argument is that Tartaria was not simply a geographic designation, but a reference to an actual civilization. A civilization that was more technologically and culturally advanced than the standard historical account acknowledges, and that built the extraordinary architectural monuments that we now attribute to various other periods and cultures. The architectural style associated with this proposed civilization is characterized by certain recurring elements. Elaborate facades with classical references, dome structures of considerable engineering sophistication, ornate stonework in materials that would have required significant resources to quarry and transport, buildings of a scale and grandeur that seemed disproportionate to the populations that supposedly built and occupied them. In Boston, the buildings that mudflood researchers point to as potential examples of this architectural tradition are primarily the great public buildings of the early to mid-19th century. Faneuil Hall, the Massachusetts State House, the Quincy Market Complex, the various churches and institutional buildings that were constructed in the Greek Revival and Federal styles during the period of Boston's greatest early growth. The standard historical account attributes these buildings to known architects working in known styles during specific documented periods. Faneuil Hall's expansion was designed by Charles Bulfinch. The State House on Beacon Hill was also Bulfinch. Quincy Market was Alexander Paris. These are names with biographies. These are architects with documented careers, documented clients, documented projects. The Tartaria researchers do not dispute that these names are associated with these buildings. What they dispute is whether those architects actually designed what is attributed to them from scratch, or whether they were working with, adapting, or completing structures that were already partially in place. Whether what appears in the historical record as new construction was in some cases renovation, completion, or adaptation of existing buildings whose origins lie in an earlier and unacknowledged period. This is a significant claim. It is not supported by the documentary record, which is fairly clear about the commissioning and construction of these buildings, but it is worth understanding why the researchers make it. What they see in these buildings that strikes them as inconsistent with the attributed origins. The primary argument is one of scale and sophistication relative to resource availability. Boston in 1800 was a prosperous town of around 25,000 people. It had wealth derived from maritime trade. It had a growing professional class. It had civic ambitions. But the scale and quality of the public buildings it produced in the first decades of the 19th century seems to the Tartaria researchers excessive relative to these resources. The Quincy Market Complex, completed in 1826, is a building of enormous scale and considerable architectural sophistication. Its long granite facades, its domed central pavilion, its precise stonework represent a level of building achievement that, in the Tartaria researchers' view, would have stretched the capabilities of a city of Boston's early 19th century size. This argument is disputed by architectural historians. The resources available to Boston in the early 19th century, they argue, were substantial. The city had access to the excellent granite quarries of Quincy and Rockport. It had skilled craftsmen who had been trained in European traditions. It had civic leaders who understood the importance of impressive public architecture and were willing to invest in it. The buildings of early Boston are extraordinary, the argument goes, because the people who built them intended them to be extraordinary and had the means to make them so. Both arguments have merit, and both arguments are, ultimately, arguments about plausibility rather than evidence. They are arguments about what seems possible, not arguments about what is documented. The physical evidence that the Tartaria researchers point to, the evidence that goes beyond the argument from plausibility, is found in the details of the buildings themselves. In the ways that certain buildings show signs of modification, alteration, or adaptation that do not match the attributed construction history. In the ways that certain features appear inconsistent with the known capabilities or preferences of the attributed architects. In the ways that certain structures, when examined from unusual angles or in unusual light, reveal characteristics that are not explained by the standard construction history. This is a form of evidence that is difficult to evaluate in summary. It requires standing in front of the buildings. It requires looking carefully. It requires the kind of attention that is hard to sustain in the course of ordinary daily life, but that becomes possible in a focused investigation. For now, in the dark of the night, with the city of Boston existing somewhere beyond these words, it is enough to know that this argument is being made. That there are people who look at the great public buildings of early 19th century Boston and see in them the remnants of an older world. A world that was buried, in the physical sense, by the mud that the researchers propose, and buried in the historical sense by the institutions that shaped what the record would say about the past. Your breathing has found its nighttime rhythm. The words come to you now from a distance, as if from a great depth, like sounds reaching down through layers of sediment to where something quiet and old waits. We continue. There is a street in Boston that should not exist at the level it exists. Washington Street, the main commercial artery that runs through downtown Boston and extends south through the South End and Roxbury, has been a primary thoroughfare since the colonial period. It follows, in its general alignment, one of the oldest roads in the region, a path that connected the Shawmut Peninsula to the mainland through the narrow neck that was the only land connection before the filling projects created the broader base the modern city sits on. Washington Street today is a busy urban arterial. It carries bus traffic and pedestrians and the scattered retail that characterizes city commercial strips that have seen better days. But if you stand on Washington Street in certain sections of the South End or the lower Roxbury border and look carefully at the buildings on either side, you will notice something that does not announce itself loudly, but that, once seen, cannot be unseen. The buildings along certain stretches of Washington Street are too tall for their lots relative to the street, not in the sense that they violate zoning, but in the sense that the proportion between their facade height and their setback from the street produces a kind of urban canyon effect that is more extreme than the original design of these buildings would have intended. Buildings that, based on their floor-to-floor heights and the number of floors they contain, should stand in a certain relationship to the street, stand instead in a relationship that is slightly off, slightly lower, as if the street has risen toward them rather than the buildings towering above the street. In some locations, this effect is dramatic enough to be unmistakable. In others, it is subtle, but the pattern is consistent, and it runs along Washington Street for miles. Not just in the old downtown core, where the documented street raisings have been most extensively studied, but further south into neighborhoods that the mainstream historical account of Boston Street improvement does not focus on as heavily. This is interesting, because if the grade anomaly were only the result of the documented 19th century street raising programs, we would expect it to be most pronounced in the areas where those programs were most intensively applied, and those areas are primarily the downtown core and the waterfront. The further you move from those areas, the less pronounced the anomaly should be, if the raising programs are the full explanation. But the anomaly does not diminish consistently as you move away from the core. In some locations that were not heavily targeted by the documented programs, the grade relationships are as anomalous as in the core. This spatial inconsistency is one of the details that the mudflood researchers point to as evidence that the standard explanation is incomplete. What could explain a consistent grade anomaly that extends beyond the areas targeted by documented street raising programs? One possibility is that the raising programs were more extensive than the documentary record shows, that records are incomplete, or that informal raising occurred in many areas without being formally documented. Another possibility is that the anomaly predates the raising programs, that the raising programs were a response to a pre-existing condition rather than the cause of the observed relationship, that whatever process created the baseline condition, the condition that required correction, was not limited to the downtown core, but affected the entire city and its surrounding area more uniformly. This second possibility is what the mudflood hypothesis predicts. A large-scale depositional event, a flood carrying significant sediment load, would not respect neighborhood boundaries. It would deposit material across a wide geographic area with a relative uniformity that would produce exactly the kind of diffuse, spatially inconsistent pattern that the Washington Street anomaly exhibits. We are not claiming this is what happened. We are noting that the physical evidence is consistent with this interpretation. Let us move from Washington Street to a specific building that has attracted considerable attention from the Boston mudflood research community, the Ames Webster House. The Ames Webster House, located in the Back Bay on Commonwealth Avenue, is one of the most architecturally extraordinary private residences in Boston. Built in 1872 for Frederick Lothrop Ames and subsequently enlarged, it is a high Victorian Gothic mansion that sits in the middle of one of the most desirable urban addresses in New England. It is also, by any objective measurement, sitting lower than it should be. The house was built on filled land. The Back Bay fill, as we discussed earlier, was deposited beginning in 1857. By 1872, when the Ames Webster House was constructed, The fill had been in place for roughly 15 years in that location. 15 years is not an insignificant period. Settlement of fill material does occur over time, and a structure built on relatively recently deposited fill might indeed sit slightly lower than its original grade after a century and a half of settlement and compaction. But the degree of apparent grade discrepancy in the Ames-Webster house is greater than what normal settlement would account for, and more significantly, the character of the grade discrepancy is inconsistent with settlement. Settlement lowers a building uniformly. It does not change the relationship between the building and the surrounding street. If the building settles, the street settles with it, because the street is also on the same fill. What the Ames-Webster house exhibits is not settlement in this sense. It exhibits a discrepancy between the building's relationship to the street and the intended design relationship. A discrepancy that suggests the street rose rather than the building sank. This is a technical distinction, but it matters, because a building that has sunk relative to the street due to differential settlement is a building with a structural problem, a building that has maintained its position, while the surrounding street rose is a building that is sitting exactly where it was put in a landscape that changed around it. The Ames-Webster house appears to be in the second category. It appears to be sitting where it was placed in 1872, in a landscape that has subsequently risen around it. Not dramatically, not enough to create serious practical problems, but enough to be measurable, enough to be visible to anyone who knows what to look for. This is one building, one data point. By itself, it proves nothing, but it is part of a pattern, and the pattern matters. As you drift further towards sleep, we want to take you somewhere specific. We want to take you underground, literally underground, to the spaces beneath the streets of Boston that have been excavated and that reveal in their physical structure the history of what happened at the surface. The MBTA, the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, operates one of the oldest subway systems in North America. The Green Line, which opened in 1897, predates the New York City subway by several years and represents the beginning of rapid transit in the United States. The tunnels of the Green Line and the various other subway tunnels that have been added to the Boston system over the subsequent century run through soil and rock that has not seen daylight since the tunnels were built. When those tunnels were constructed, the workers who built them encountered the layers of Boston's past. They encountered colonial-era fill and debris. They encountered the remnants of structures that had stood on the surface before the city grew over and around them. They encountered, in some sections, material that engineers at the time described as anomalous, as not matching the expected stratigraphy for the area. The records of subway construction in Boston are extensive. The engineering reports from the original Green Line construction, from the Blue Line construction in the early 20th century, from the Red Line and Orange Line extensions of the mid-20th century, and from the more recent Green Line extension project that was completed in the early 21st century, all contain references to unexpected conditions encountered during excavation. Some of these unexpected conditions were geological. The rock and soil conditions in Boston are complex. The Boston blue clay, a distinctive marine clay deposit that underlies much of the city, presents particular engineering challenges. The presence of boulders deposited by glacial action creates unpredictable subsurface conditions. These are the kinds of geological surprises that engineers expect and plan for. But some of the unexpected conditions were not geological. They were structural. They were cultural. They were the remnants of previous human activity encountered at depths that were inconsistent with the accepted historical timeline for that activity. The official response to such finds, in most cases, was to treat them as archaeological resources, requiring brief documentation before construction proceeded. The MBTA, like most infrastructure agencies, operates under federal and state historic preservation regulations that require a certain level of archaeological assessment for projects that disturb the ground. This assessment is conducted by professional archaeologists who examine the material, document it, and write reports that are filed with the relevant state agencies. These reports are public documents. They are available to researchers, and they tell a story, in aggregate, that is more interesting than any single report suggests. The story they tell is a story of a city built on multiple layers of prior occupation, with material from each layer appearing at depths that sometimes match and sometimes do not match the depths that would be predicted by the accepted historical account. The mismatches are not always dramatic. Often they fall within the range of what archaeology accepts as normal variation. But the pattern of mismatches, the fact that they occur consistently in certain directions, toward deeper rather than shallower placement of material, is something that the mudflood researchers consider significant. Deeper placement of cultural material than expected is exactly what you would predict if a depositional event had occurred. If a layer of mud and debris had been laid down over an existing layer of human occupation, the human occupation would appear, in subsequent excavation, at a depth that does not match the timeline predicted by the accepted historical account. The material would appear too deep. It would appear to be older than it is, based on its position in the stratigraphy. This is the core evidentiary argument of the mudflood hypothesis, as it applies to archaeological findings. Not that the material itself is older than it appears to be, but that the stratigraphy was disturbed by the depositional event in ways that make the material appear older than the accepted historical account would predict. This argument is not impossible to evaluate. It is, in principle, testable. The characteristics of flood-deposited sediment are well understood by geologists. The ways in which a depositional event would disturb existing stratigraphy are predictable. If the mudflood occurred, there should be geologically identifiable evidence of it in the subsurface of affected cities. The mudflood researchers argue that this evidence exists. They point to studies of sediment cores taken from Boston Harbor and from the tidal areas around the city that show evidence of depositional events within the past several centuries. They point to stratigraphic anomalies in excavation records that are consistent with rapid, high-energy deposition. They argue that the evidence has been collected, but that its interpretation has been shaped by a prior commitment to the accepted historical account. The mainstream geological and archaeological interpretation of the same evidence is different. The depositional events visible in sediment cores are attributed to storm surges, to documented historical floods of limited scale, to natural variability in sedimentation patterns. The stratigraphic anomalies in excavation records are attributed to the various well-understood processes that disturb archaeological stratigraphy over time. We are in the territory of interpretive disagreement. The same physical evidence, read by people with different assumptions, produces different conclusions. This is not unusual in any field of inquiry. It is not unique to this topic. It is the condition of all knowledge that has not yet been definitively settled. What is unusual about this topic is the degree to which the interpretive disagreement maps onto institutional versus non-institutional positions. The mainstream interpretation is held by people with institutional affiliations, university positions, government agency roles, museum curators. The alternative interpretation is held, in most cases, by independent researchers without formal academic affiliations, by people who have arrived at their conclusions through their own study and who present their findings primarily through platforms that operate outside the academic review system. This mapping of interpretive positions onto institutional versus non-institutional categories does not, by itself, tell us which interpretation is correct. Institutional affiliation is not a guarantee of truth. The history of science and scholarship is full of examples of institutional consensus being wrong and of outsiders being right. But it is also full of examples of institutional consensus being correct and of outsider claims being unfounded. What it tells us is something about the sociology of this particular debate, about who is asking these questions and from what position they are asking them, about the barriers that exist to having this kind of inquiry taken seriously by the institutions that have the resources to investigate it properly. These are interesting questions in themselves. Questions about how knowledge is produced and validated. Questions about what gets investigated and what does not. Questions about the relationship between institutional power and historical narrative. But we have wandered a little from Boston. Let us return. There is a photograph, many photographs actually, but one in particular that mudflood researchers return to repeatedly when discussing Boston. It is a photograph taken sometime in the 1860s or 1870s, during the period of intensive urban development and transformation that followed the Civil War. The photograph shows a street in the downtown area of Boston, looking along the line of buildings toward the harbor. The buildings in the photograph are a mix of commercial and institutional structures, most of them built in the Federal or early Greek Revival style that dominated Boston's first great period of architectural achievement. What the photograph shows, when examined carefully, is that the lower portions of several of the buildings in the frame appear to be below the street grade. Not dramatically below, not obviously below, to someone who is not looking for it. But the relationship between the building facades and the sidewalk level does not match what it would be if those buildings had been built at grade in the way that their architectural character suggests. The buildings show the markers of Federal-style design, the regular window rhythms, the restrained ornamental details, the carefully proportioned facades. These are buildings that were designed by people who understood how buildings relate to streets, who understood that the ground floor should read as a base from which the upper floors rise, who understood that the relationship between interior floor levels and exterior grade is part of the architectural composition. In the photograph, that relationship is wrong. The buildings look as if they have settled, as if the ground has risen around them, as if they are the same buildings that were designed and built with a specific grade relationship, but that the grade around them has subsequently changed. This could be explained as a photographic distortion. Old photographs do not always accurately represent spatial relationships. The lenses available to 19th century photographers introduce distortions that can create false impressions of grade relationships. But the mudflood researchers who have analyzed this and similar photographs argue that the distortion hypothesis does not account for what is visible. They argue that the relationship between the buildings and the street is consistently anomalous across multiple photographs, taken at different times and from different angles and with different equipment. The debate about old photographs as evidence is representative of a broader methodological challenge in the mudflood research community. The evidence that is most visually compelling, the photographs that appear to show buried or partially buried buildings, the illustrations that appear to show grade relationships inconsistent with the accepted construction history, is also the evidence that is most vulnerable to the critique of misinterpretation. Because photographs and illustrations are inherently ambiguous, they require interpretation, and interpretation is shaped by the assumptions the interpreter brings to the material. The mudflood researchers bring the assumption that burial occurred and look for evidence of burial. The mainstream historians bring the assumption that burial did not occur in the form proposed and interpret the same visual evidence within the framework of normal urban development. Each group finds what its assumptions lead it to look for. This is the epistemological bind at the heart of the mudflood debate, and it is not easily escaped, because the kind of evidence that would definitively resolve the question, a comprehensive, systematic, institutionally funded investigation of subsurface conditions in major affected cities, with the specific purpose of testing the mudflood hypothesis, has never been conducted. The hypothesis has never been taken seriously enough by the institutions that could investigate it to receive the resources that investigation would require, The mud flood researchers argue that this absence of investigation is itself evidence of suppression, that the hypothesis is not being ignored because it is obviously wrong, but because it is dangerous, because confirming it would require a fundamental revision of the historical account that the current institutional order is built upon, because the people and organizations that benefit from the current historical narrative have reasons to prevent that narrative from being challenged. This is a familiar argument in the world of alternative history. It is the argument that the absence of institutional support for a hypothesis is explained not by the weakness of the hypothesis, but by the strength of the forces arrayed against it. It is an argument that is, by its nature, very difficult to refute, because any refutation can be incorporated into the framework as further evidence of suppression. We present this argument not to endorse it, but to make it legible, to explain why the researchers who hold it find it compelling and why they continue to pursue the evidence, despite the lack of institutional support. The night is deep now. The questions are deep. The city of Boston is deep, layer upon layer, the modern streets floating above the buried past. Let us go to a specific place. Let us go to the corner of Washington Street and School Street, in the old downtown core of Boston, and stand there for a moment in the imagination. This corner is one of the most historically dense locations in the United States. Within a short walk, you have the Old State House, the site of the Boston Massacre, the Old South Meeting House, King's Chapel, the granary burying ground where Paul Revere and Samuel Adams and John Hancock are interred, and the Parker House Hotel, where the Boston cream pie was invented, and where Charles Dickens stayed when he visited America. This is the core of colonial Boston, the center from which everything else radiated, the place where the history that every American schoolchild learns actually happened. Stand at this corner in your imagination and look down, not at the street, through the asphalt and the concrete and the layers of fill and the colonial debris and the pre-colonial soil, through all of it to whatever is at the bottom. What is at the bottom? The geological record says glacial till, the material left behind when the last great ice sheet retreated from New England, roughly 12,000 years ago. On top of that, organic material, the accumulation of plant matter and soil development over the millennia of post-glacial time. On top of that, the deposits of human occupation, beginning with the earliest native peoples who lived in this region, perhaps 10,000 years ago or more. On top of that, the colonial deposits beginning in 1630. On top of that, the 19th century fills and raisings. On top of that, the modern infrastructure. That is what the standard geological and archaeological account says is at the bottom of this corner, and in broad strokes that account is probably accurate. But the mud flood researchers ask, what is between the deepest layers of native occupation and the colonial occupation? What is in that zone if there was a catastrophic depositional event that separated the pre-colonial world from the colonial one? What would we find in a systematic excavation of that transitional layer? And they ask, what is in the early colonial deposits themselves? What do the artifacts and structural remains from the first century of English occupation in Boston tell us about the conditions that the colonists encountered when they arrived? Was the Shawmut Peninsula a clean slate? Or were there already remnants there of something older, something the colonists built on top of, or incorporated into their own structures, or simply recorded in passing and then forgot? These are questions that are addressable, in principle, through systematic archaeological investigation. The technology exists to investigate them. The professional expertise exists. What has not existed, so far, is the will and the resources to pursue this particular line of inquiry. We do not know what that investigation would find. We are honest about that. The mud flood hypothesis makes predictions about what would be found, and those predictions might be confirmed or they might be disconfirmed. Either outcome would be valuable. Either outcome would tell us something important about the history of this place. But the investigation has not been done, and in its absence, we are left with the questions. Sleep is close now. The questions are becoming part of the landscape of the night. Shapes in the dark that do not demand resolution, that simply exist alongside the darkness and the quiet breathing. We are going to spend the next portion of this documentary looking at the broader context, moving beyond Boston to understand what Boston fits into. Because the buried city of Boston is not an isolated phenomenon. It is part of a pattern that spans the continent, and understanding that pattern is essential to understanding what might have happened here. The pattern begins in the east and moves west. It follows the line of European settlement and development in North America. And it is this, everywhere, that the great expansion of American civilization in the 19th century put down its roots. Everywhere that cities and towns were founded and grew and were documented by the expanding apparatus of survey and journalism and government record-keeping, the same phenomenon appears. Buildings below grade, streets above the level of the structures they serve, architectural features designed for light and air now facing into soil. The lower registers of the built environment consistently buried beneath an accumulation that the standard historical account attributes to gradual processes, but that the physical evidence suggests may have occurred more rapidly. The cities of the American South show this pattern. New Orleans, which has its own extraordinary and complex relationship with the ground it occupies, sits in a bowl that is in large part man-made, the result of deliberate reclamation of swampy ground. But the pattern of grade anomalies in New Orleans's oldest neighborhoods is not fully explained by the reclamation history. The relationship between the oldest structures in the French Quarter and the surrounding streets is wrong in ways that persist, despite the various documented interventions in the city's grade relationships. Charleston, South Carolina, which is one of the oldest and most historically intact cities in the American South, shows a consistent pattern of buildings that appear to be partially below their intended grade. The famous single-house typology of Charleston, in which houses are built with their narrow end to the street and their long axis running back from the street, includes, in many of its older examples, a relationship between the first floor and the street grade that does not match the intended design relationship. Savannah, Georgia, where the extraordinary grid of squares laid out by James Oglethorpe in 1733 creates one of the most beautiful urban plans in the Americas, has buildings in its oldest neighborhoods that sit in grade relationships to the surrounding streets and squares that are not quite right. Not dramatically, not in ways that make the city seem ruined or degraded, but consistently, subtly, persistently, not quite right in the direction that would be predicted by a depositional event. Moving north, Philadelphia shows the pattern, Baltimore shows it, Richmond, Washington, D.C., where the extraordinary public buildings of the federal capital sit in grade relationships that the mudflood researchers have analyzed in considerable detail, with findings that parallel what is seen in Boston. Moving west, the pattern continues. Cincinnati, which was one of the fastest-growing cities in America in the early 19th century, has a downtown core whose buildings sit in grade relationships that have attracted the attention of the mudflood research community. St. Louis, at the center of the Great Expansion, shows it. Chicago, which was largely rebuilt after the catastrophic fire of 1871, and which therefore presents a somewhat different evidentiary situation, nonetheless shows evidence of pre-fire structures and grade relationships that do not fully match the accepted construction history. The researchers who have documented this pattern argue that the consistency across geography is meaningful. They argue that if the grade anomalies were the result of local decisions about street improvement and urban development, you would expect variation. You would expect some cities to show the anomaly and others not to. You would expect the pattern to be correlated with specific documented local decisions, rather than being uniformly present across the entire spectrum of American urban development. Instead, the pattern appears everywhere. With local variations in degree and character, yes, but the underlying phenomenon, buildings sitting lower than their design suggests they should, streets higher than the buildings that line them, grade relationships that do not quite match the intended architectural relationships, appears in city after city across the continent. The mudflood hypothesis offers an explanation for this uniformity. A continental-scale depositional event would produce a continental-scale pattern. A single cause would produce a geographically consistent effect. The mainstream historical explanation for the uniformity, to the extent that it addresses it at all, is the uniformity of 19th century American urban engineering practice. Cities across America in the 19th century were all doing the same things. They were all raising their streets for drainage. They were all filling their waterfronts for expansion. They were all applying the same engineering principles to the same urban problems. So it is not surprising that the results look similar. This is a reasonable response. But the mudflood researchers argue that it still does not account for the scale of the raising or for the spatial pattern of the anomalies within individual cities. It explains why different cities look similar to each other. It does not fully explain why, within each city, the anomaly is as extensive and as consistent as it is. The night air is still, the city is still. Whatever lies beneath the streets is still, as it has been still for a very long time. We are going to look now at one of the most specific and one of the most contested pieces of evidence in the Boston mudflood discussion. The evidence from the Boston Athenaeum. The Boston Athenaeum is one of the oldest and most distinguished private libraries in the United States. Founded in 1807, it has occupied its current location on Beacon Street, just off the Park Street corner of the Boston Common, since 1849. The building that it currently occupies is a remarkable Italianate structure, designed by Edward Clark Cabot, widely considered one of the finest examples of mid-19th century institutional architecture in New England. The Athenaeum sits on Beacon Street at a point where the grade of the street and the grade of the building show a discrepancy that has been noted by several researchers. The building's entrance level and the surrounding street grade do not match in the way they would if both had been established at the same time on undisturbed ground. The street appears to have risen in relation to the building. What makes the Athenaeum particularly interesting to the mudflood researchers is not only the grade relationship, but the history of the site. The Athenaeum's location on Beacon Street is on the south slope of Beacon Hill, the hill that was most intensively modified by the 19th century cutting projects. The cutting of Beacon Hill removed millions of cubic yards of material from the summit and upper slopes of the hill. Where did that material go? Some of it went into the harbour as fill for new land, but some of it, by the logic of gravity and proximity, would have been deposited on the lower slopes and at the base of the hill. If material from the cutting of Beacon Hill was deposited on the lower slopes as the cutting proceeded, then the buildings on those lower slopes would have been progressively buried by the descending fill. Their lower levels would have been covered. Their entrances would have been changed. The grade relationship between them and the surrounding terrain would have shifted as the cutting proceeded. This is not the mudflood. This is documented human engineering. But the result, in terms of the physical appearance of the buildings, would be similar. Buildings partially buried by anthropogenic processes, their lower registers below the surrounding grade, their design relationships to the street altered by subsequent fill. The question is whether this process, which is documented and understood, accounts for all of the grade anomalies observed in Boston, or whether it was itself in part a response to a prior condition, whether the cutting and filling was not only the result of deliberate urban planning decisions, but also, in part, a response to a pre-existing situation in which the city's grade relationships were already disturbed. This is the kind of layered question that the mudflood research invites. Not a simple either-or, but a both and also. The documented processes are real, and they may be responses to something prior. Both things can be true simultaneously, and the complexity of the causal chain is part of what makes this inquiry interesting and resistant to easy resolution. Let us look at the photographs of the Athenaeum from the mid-19th century. In these photographs, the building appears in its early years before the surrounding streetscape had developed into its current form. And in these early photographs, the grade relationships are different from what they are today. The building sits in a different relationship to the surrounding terrain. The difference is not dramatic, but it is measurable. Over the decades between those early photographs and the present day, the surrounding street grade rose. By how much, and through what specific processes, is not entirely clear from the available documentation. But the rise is visible in the photographs, and the mudflood researchers argue that the rate and character of the rise, visible across the span of decades in the photographic record, is consistent with processes that were in part clearing and leveling the effects of a prior depositional event, rather than purely adding material for engineering purposes. This is a fine evidentiary distinction, and it is the kind of distinction that is very difficult to evaluate without systematic measurement and a controlled study. The kind of study that has not been conducted. In its absence, we are left with the photographs and the grade relationships and the questions they raise. One more location before we move into the final portions of this documentary. One more specific place in Boston that carries the evidence particularly clearly and that has attracted particular attention from the research community. Copley Square. Copley Square is a large public square in the Back Bay, surrounded by some of the most important buildings in Boston. Trinity Church, designed by H. Richardson and completed in 1877, is widely considered one of the great masterworks of American architecture. The Boston Public Library, designed by McKim, Mead, and White, and completed in 1895, is a monument to civic ambition and humanistic aspiration. The old Copley Plaza Hotel, later the Fairmont Copley Plaza, is a grand Beaux-Arts palace. Together, these buildings define one of the great urban spaces in America. Copley Square sits on filled land. All of the Back Bay does. It was created from mudflats and open water beginning in 1857. By the time Trinity Church was built in 1877, the fill had been in place for roughly 20 years in that location. By the time the library was completed in 1895, the fill had been settling for nearly 40 years. The grade relationships in Copley Square today are not what the original architects intended them to be. Trinity Church, in particular, shows evidence of having settled relative to its surroundings. The original entrance steps, which were designed to create a specific processional relationship between the approaching visitor and the building's entrance portal, now sit in a different relationship to the surrounding grade than Richardson's design intended. The church appears lower in its setting than the design drawings suggest it was meant to be. The official explanation is settlement of the fill. Trinity Church is a very heavy building, built on a complex and innovative foundation system that includes hundreds of wooden piles driven into the saturated fill. Those piles have settled over the century and a half since construction, and the building has settled with them. This is documented. Trinity Church has had ongoing foundation problems and remediation work throughout its history. The settlement is real, and it is the result of the challenges of building such a heavy structure on relatively recently deposited fill. But the mudflood researchers point out something interesting about the settlement at Trinity Church. The settlement is not uniform. The building has settled differentially, with some portions settling more than others. This differential settlement has caused cracking and structural distress that has required remediation over the years. But the overall direction of the settlement, the way the building has moved in relation to the surrounding fill, is not consistent with what you would expect if the fill itself were the primary cause. Settlement of a building on fill should be primarily a function of the building's weight, pressing down into the compressible fill material. Heavy buildings sink into soft fill. This is straightforward geotechnical mechanics, but Trinity Church has not simply sunk uniformly into the fill. It has moved in ways that suggest the fill itself has been moving, that the material beneath the building has been consolidating and compacting in ways that are not solely a function of the building's weight sitting on it. The geotechnical explanation for this is complex and involves the dynamics of saturated clay consolidation, which is a real and well-understood phenomenon. Boston blue clay, which underlies the Back Bay fill, is a highly compressible material that consolidates over time under load. The consolidation of the clay beneath the fill causes the fill itself to settle, and buildings on the fill settle with it. This is a real process. It is the primary geotechnical explanation for the ongoing ground settlement that affects the entire Back Bay neighborhood and that has been monitored by engineers for decades. But the mudflood researchers argue, again, that this process explains the mechanics without explaining the initial condition. That the saturated clay and the overlying fill represent a condition that was created by a depositional event, not simply by the natural state of the tidal flats that predated the fill program. That the clay itself carries evidence of the event in its structure and composition. This is a claim that requires geotechnical expertise to evaluate. It is not a claim that can be assessed from the surface. It is a claim about what the soil tells us at depth, about what the structure of the clay layers reveals about the processes that created them. The relevant studies exist. The Boston blue clay has been extensively studied by geotechnical engineers because it is a constant challenge for construction in the Back Bay. Its depositional history has been investigated. Its properties have been characterized. The studies are in the technical literature. The mudflood researchers argue that those studies contain evidence that supports their interpretation, but that this evidence has been interpreted within a framework that does not allow for the conclusions they draw. The mainstream geotechnical engineers argue that the studies are straightforward and that the clay's properties are well explained by the standard account of glacial and post-glacial marine sedimentation. We are again in the territory of interpretive disagreement, shaped by prior assumptions. Your breath is slow and deep now. The city of Boston is somewhere in the dark, its streets floating above the clay, above the fill, above the buried layers of everything that came before. The buildings standing in their slightly wrong grade relationships, their lower registers reaching down into the ground, their designs carrying the memory of a different relationship to the surface. The questions float in the dark too, not demanding answers, not urgent, just there, the way that old things are there, patient, present, waiting. We have one more major area of evidence to examine before we begin the final portion of this documentary, and it is perhaps the most personal, the most human. The evidence that comes from the people who lived through the period in question and who left records of what they observed. The journals and letters and newspaper accounts and official reports of the early 19th century in Boston contain, scattered through the mass of daily record keeping, observations that are worth collecting and reading together. Observations that, when assembled, paint a picture of a city that was managing a situation rather than simply developing in the normal course of urban growth. There are accounts from the early years of the century of streets that were perpetually above the level of the adjacent buildings, not in the downtown core, where the street-raising programs were most intensive, but in peripheral neighborhoods where the programs were less documented. Streets that had risen, in the memory of the people writing about them, from a lower to a higher grade, without a clear documented cause. There are accounts from workers engaged in the various excavation projects of the period, cutting hills, laying sewers, building foundations for the new institutional buildings of the growing city, of finding things at unexpected depths. Not always dramatic things, often just evidence of prior disturbance, of soil that had been moved before, of layers that did not match the expected stratigraphy. There are accounts from old residents, people who had lived in Boston since the late 18th century, who observed in the early 19th century that the city looked different than it had in their youth. Not just because of new construction, because the existing buildings seemed lower, the streets seemed higher. The relationship between the built environment and the ground beneath it had shifted in ways they found difficult to articulate, but impossible to ignore. These are fragmentary accounts. They are scattered through the archive, and finding them requires systematic research of the kind that the mudflood community has done, but that mainstream historical scholarship has not focused on, because mainstream scholarship is not looking for this kind of evidence. It is looking for other things, for the political history, the social history, the economic history of the period, and it finds those things in abundance. The grade relationships and the grade anomalies are peripheral concerns, not central ones, but they are there, in the archive, in the testimony of the people who lived in the city during the period when, according to the mudflood hypothesis, the aftermath of the event was most visible and most actively being managed. And they add to the picture. They are not conclusive, but they are consistent with the physical evidence, consistent with the patterns observed in other cities, consistent with the broad outlines of what the mudflood hypothesis predicts would have been observable in the immediate aftermath of the event. Consistent, but not confirmed. That distinction matters. We want to maintain it. We are not telling you that the mudflood happened. We are telling you that the evidence is consistent with it having happened. These are different claims. The first is an assertion. The second is an observation. We prefer the observation. The observation is this. In Boston, as in many other American cities, there is physical and documentary evidence of grade anomalies, of buried structures, of unexpected subsurface conditions, that is not fully explained by the standard historical account of gradual urban development. The mudflood hypothesis offers an explanation for this evidence that is internally consistent and that accounts for the spatial and temporal patterns of the anomalies. That explanation has not been conclusively confirmed by systematic investigation. It has also not been conclusively disproven. We are in the space of genuine uncertainty, in the space that all honest inquiry eventually finds itself at the edge of what is known, looking into the territory of what remains to be established. That territory is Boston's buried past. It is there, beneath the streets, beneath the filled land, beneath the cut hills, in the clay, in the piles, in the foundations of the old buildings, in the timber structures that workers found in the fill and set aside and forgot. It is there, waiting, and we are here, in the night, with our questions, attending to it. The final portion of this documentary is going to go somewhere different. We have spent a great deal of time with the physical evidence, with the grade anomalies and the buried structures and the subsurface findings and the photographic record and the archival accounts. We have built a picture of what the evidence shows and what questions it raises. Now we want to sit with the larger question, the question behind all the other questions, the question that the mudflood hypothesis and the Tartaria narrative are ultimately pointing toward. What would it mean if it were true? If the buried city of Boston is not simply the result of normal urban development processes, but is the physical remainder of something that happened suddenly, something catastrophic, something that reset the conditions of civilization in a relatively short period of time. What would that mean for how we understand ourselves and our world? This is not an empirical question. It cannot be answered by evidence. It is a philosophical question, a question about meaning and narrative and the stories we tell about where we come from and what we are capable of. The standard historical account of the modern world is a story of progress, of gradual, continuous, cumulative development, from less sophisticated to more sophisticated, from less organized to more organized, from less powerful to more powerful. The arc of the story bends upward. Humanity, in this account, has been steadily building toward where we are now, each generation inheriting from the last and adding to the inheritance. The Tartaria narrative disrupts this arc. It proposes that the upward bend was not continuous, that there was a great breaking, a catastrophe that reduced civilization from a level of sophistication that was, in some ways, greater than what came after it, to a condition from which the rebuilding had to begin. The world that exists now is not the peak of the continuous upward arc. It is the product of recovery from a crash. This is a different kind of story. It is, in many ways, a darker story, but it is also, in certain respects, a more humble one. It locates us not at the pinnacle of an ascending line, but in the middle of a longer and more complex arc. It suggests that the capacities of human civilization are both greater than the standard account acknowledges, because we were once further along than we currently realize, and more fragile, because what was built before was brought down and much of it was lost. This combination of greater potential and greater fragility is psychologically a challenging place to live. It requires a kind of double consciousness, an appreciation for what has been achieved alongside a recognition that achievement is not necessarily permanent, that the great buildings and the great institutions and the great knowledge systems of any era are subject to forces that can undo them. The people who find the mudflood narrative compelling often describe a particular emotional experience when they first encounter it, a sensation of recognition, of something clicking into place, of a story that explains things that the standard account left unexplained. Not just the physical anomalies, the buried buildings, and the wrong grade relationships, but something less tangible, a feeling about the world, a sense that things are not quite what they appear to be, that there is something underneath the surface of the official story, just as there is something underneath the surface of the modern streets. This emotional experience is worth taking seriously, even if the specific claims of the narrative remain unproven. Because the feeling that official accounts are incomplete, that there are stories not being told, that the institutions of knowledge are not fully honest about what they know, is not baseless. It is grounded in a real feature of how knowledge institutions work. They do suppress and simplify and frame. They do make choices about what to emphasize and what to leave in the footnotes. The specific claim that they are suppressing evidence of a global catastrophic flood may or may not be true. But the general experience of official knowledge as incomplete is legitimate. The mudflood community and the broader alternative history community of which it is part exists in part because of this legitimate feeling, because people who have that feeling need somewhere to take it, need a community of inquiry where the questions they are asking are taken seriously, need a narrative that gives structure and meaning to their sense that something is being left out. The community has its problems. It generates claims that are not supported by evidence. It sometimes shades into conspiratorial thinking that is not productive. It is vulnerable to exploitation by people who want to use the genuine curiosity of the community for other purposes. But the curiosity itself is real and it is valuable. The impulse to look underneath the official story, to check the grade relationships, to wonder what is below the streets, is a good impulse. A healthy one, a human one. Boston rewards that impulse. It is a city that has layers, that is honest about its layers, in the sense that the evidence of its layered past is visible in the streets and the buildings for anyone who knows what to look for. It is also a city that has not fully reckoned with its deepest layers. That has focused its historical attention on the stories that serve its self-image, the revolutionary city, the intellectual city, the city of liberty, and has paid less attention to the stories that sit underneath those stories. The buried city is one of those stories. Whatever created it, whether normal urban development or something more dramatic, it is real. The lower levels are there, The buried remnants are there. The great anomalies are there. The questions are there. This documentary has been an attempt to attend to those questions, not to resolve them, not to tell you what to believe, to lay them out, carefully and honestly, and let them sit in the dark alongside you as the night deepens and the breath slows and the ordinary world of surface and street and modern city recedes into something quieter. The buried city of Boston is quiet now. Whatever happened to it, however it came to be underground, it has been underground for a long time. It has had decades and centuries to settle into its burial. The soil has compacted around it. The roots of trees have threaded through it. The rain has percolated down through the layers and reached it and moved on. It is not going anywhere. Neither are the questions it raises. Let us spend the remaining time in this documentary simply present with those questions, not pushing toward resolution, not seeking confirmation or disconfirmation, just present. What was here before the colonial settlement? What did the Massachusetts people, who lived on this peninsula for generations before the English arrived, know about what the land held? What did the first English settlers find when they began to build? What did they record and what did they choose not to record? What do the grade relationships of the oldest buildings tell us about the conditions that existed when they were built? What do the subsurface findings of the various engineering and construction projects tell us about what is underneath? What would a thorough, systematic, open-minded investigation of the subsurface of old Boston find? We do not know. Nobody knows. Because the investigation has not been done. It should be done. That is perhaps the clearest and most defensible claim that can be made at the conclusion of this inquiry. Whatever the investigation would find, the finding would be valuable. If it confirmed the standard account, that would be worth knowing. If it found something anomalous, something that required rethinking the standard account, that would be even more worth knowing. The buried city of Boston deserves the attention. It has waited long enough. Your body is heavy now, with the comfortable weight of approaching sleep. The streets of Boston are somewhere in the dark, carrying their burden of history, sitting above the buried world, going about the business of a modern city with no particular awareness of what lies beneath. But you are aware. You have spent this time attending to the question. You carry it with you now, gently, as you move towards sleep. What lies beneath the streets of Boston? The answer is layers. It is always layers. And within the layers, the evidence. And within the evidence, the questions. And within the questions, the possibility of understanding something that has been underground for a very long time. Sleep now. The buried city will be there in the morning. The questions will be there. The evidence will be there. And so will the curiosity. That essential, irreplaceable human impulse to look underneath the surface of things and ask what is really there. That is where we leave you tonight, in the quiet, in the dark, in the deep and patient company of buried things. Good night. But the story does not end there, because there is more to Boston's buried history than what we have examined so far. We have spent time with the physical evidence, with the grade anomalies and the subsurface findings, and the architectural details and the archival accounts. But there is another layer to this inquiry, a layer that concerns not what is beneath the streets, but what is built on top of them, and what the buildings themselves, when looked at carefully, reveal about the circumstances of their construction. We are going to return to the architecture, because the architecture is speaking. It has been speaking for a long time, quietly, in the language of proportion and material and grade relationship and stylistic anomaly. We have been learning to listen to it over the course of this documentary. Now let us listen more carefully. The great public buildings of early 19th century Boston are, as we have noted, extraordinary achievements. The State House on Beacon Hill, with its golden dome that has presided over the city for more than 2 centuries. Faneuil Hall, the cradle of liberty, the churches and institutions and commercial buildings that give the old city its character. These buildings are extraordinary, and the question that the Tartaria researchers ask about them is not whether they are extraordinary, it is how they came to be so extraordinary, given the circumstances of their construction. The argument from the Tartaria perspective is not that the named architects did not exist, or that they were not talented. It is that the buildings attributed to them in the early 19th century represent a level of achievement that is difficult to fully account for, given the documented resources of the period, that the rapidity with which such sophisticated buildings appeared, the speed with which Boston went from a colonial town to a city of genuinely impressive public architecture, suggests that the architects of the early republic were working with something more than their own genius and the resources of their moment. What that something more might be, the Tartaria researchers offer various answers. Some suggest that the architects were drawing on and adapting existing structures whose origins lay in an earlier and unacknowledged period. Some suggest that the builders had access to knowledge and techniques that are not accounted for in the standard history of American architectural education. Some suggest that the buildings themselves are older than attributed, that the dates given for their construction are the dates of renovation or completion rather than of original construction. These are extraordinary claims. They require extraordinary evidence. And the evidence offered for them is, in most cases, the kind of observational and inferential evidence that we have been examining throughout this documentary. Evidence that is consistent with the claims, but that does not definitively prove them. There is one category of architectural evidence that is more specific, that concerns the buildings not as wholes but in their details, in the specific ways that certain features appear in buildings across widely separated geographic locations, in styles and periods that the standard historical account treats as distinct and unconnected. The dome. This is the feature that the Tartaria researchers return to most frequently. Domes appear in the great public buildings of early 19th century America with a frequency and a sophistication that the standard account of architectural training and influence does not fully explain. The dome of the Massachusetts State House, the dome of the United States Capitol, the domes of the great state capitals that were built across the expanding republic, the domes of the custom houses and the courthouses and the universities. Domes are engineering achievements. They require not only the knowledge of their form, but the technical capacity to execute them in stone or metal or brick, to manage the structural forces that a dome generates, to finish the interior surfaces in a way that achieves the acoustic and aesthetic effects intended. The people who built these domes knew what they were doing in a technical sense that goes beyond what a self-taught provincial craftsman could have acquired. The standard account is that this knowledge came from Europe, that the architects of the early American Republic were educated in the European tradition through pattern books and through travel and through the influence of immigrant craftsmen who brought European training with them. And this is true. The European connection is documented and it is real. But the Tartaria researchers argue that it is incomplete, that the dome tradition in America was not purely derivative of European influence, but drew on something else as well, something that was already present in the New World, something that was there before the European architects and their pattern books arrived. What that something is, the researchers are less specific about. Some invoke the lost civilization of Tartaria, the global culture that supposedly built in this style around the world, and whose American branch was responsible for structures that predate the colonial period. Some are more modest in their claims, suggesting only that there was a pre-existing building tradition in North America that has not been acknowledged by the standard historical account, and that influenced the development of American public architecture in ways that remain to be fully understood. The modesty of the latter claim is notable, because it is the kind of claim that is, in principle, investigable. If there were a pre-existing, sophisticated building tradition in North America, it would leave traces, physical traces in the form of structures and artifacts, cultural traces in the form of knowledge and technique that was absorbed into later practice, archaeological traces in the form of subsurface remains. Whether such traces exist, and whether the existing evidence of them has been properly recognized and interpreted, is a legitimate question for historical and archaeological inquiry. We return to Boston now, to the specific character of its public architecture in the early 19th century, and we want to sit with a particular building that has not come up yet in this documentary, and that deserves attention. The Old North Church. The Old North Church, officially Christ Church in the city of Boston, is the oldest surviving church building in Boston. It was built in 1723, making it nearly 300 years old. It sits in the North End, the oldest continuously occupied neighborhood in the city, and it has a relationship to its surrounding grade that is among the most clearly anomalous of any building in Boston. The Old North Church was built on a slight rise in the North End terrain. Its siting takes advantage of this rise to give the building visual prominence in the surrounding neighborhood. When you approach it through the narrow streets of the North End, the church appears elevated, sitting on its rise, its tall steeple reaching above the surrounding buildings. But the degree of elevation is more than the underlying terrain accounts for. The surrounding streets have risen around the church in the documented pattern that we have been examining throughout this documentary. The rise that is natural has been supplemented by an artificial rise. The fill and the street improvements of the 19th century have added to the grade around the church in ways that make the natural topographic relationship more pronounced than it was when the church was built. The interesting thing about the Old North Church in this context is not only the grade relationship, but the foundation. The church's foundation extends well below the current grade. Excavations conducted during various phases of restoration, work over the church's history, have found the foundation to extend to a depth that is greater than would be necessary for the structure it supports. A foundation that goes deeper than structural necessity requires is a foundation that was designed for a different grade relationship. A foundation designed for a grade that was lower than the current surrounding grade. A foundation designed for a world in which the surrounding terrain was at the church's original floor level rather than several feet above it. This is not a dramatic claim about global catastrophe. It is an observation about foundation depth and grade relationship. But it is an observation that is consistent with a story of burial, with a story of a building whose surroundings have risen around it, leaving its foundation deeper in the ground than it was when it was built. The Old North Church has been there for 3 centuries. It has watched the North End change around it. It has watched the streets rise and the fill arrive and the neighboring buildings come and go. It has sat in its slightly anomalous relationship to the surrounding grade, its deep foundation reaching down into the evidence of what came before, its tall steeple pointing up toward the sky that it has always faced. It is one of the most visited historic sites in America. Tourists come from around the world to see the steeple from which 2 lanterns were hung to signal Paul Revere that the British were coming by sea. They come for the history that is documented and celebrated and taught in schools. They do not usually come to look at the foundation depth, but the foundation is there, patient and quiet and deeper than it needs to be, carrying its own silent evidence of the layered past. We have reached the place in this documentary where it is time to let the words slow and the images dissolve and the questions settle into the quiet of the deepening night. Boston is there, beneath your awareness somewhere, a city with layers, a city that was built on something, that was rebuilt perhaps on something even older, that carries in its grade relationships and its foundation depths and its architectural anomalies and its subsurface archaeology, the evidence of a history more complex than the standard account presents. The mudflood hypothesis may be right, it may be wrong, It may be partially right, pointing toward real anomalies while offering an explanation that is more dramatic than the evidence requires. The Tartaria narrative may contain genuine historical insight, or it may be a modern myth, a story that the present moment needs for reasons that are more psychological than historical. We do not know, and that not knowing is not a failure. It is the honest position. It is where the evidence actually leaves us, in the uncertainty, in the space between the documented and the unexamined, in the gap between the street level and the buried world. That gap is real. Whatever fills it, the gap is real. The city of Boston was built on something. What that something was, fully and completely, and in its deepest layers, is a question that has not been answered, that has, in large measure, not been asked, not in the systematic and open-minded way that would allow the question to find its answer. The answer is down there, in the clay, in the fill, in the timber structures that workers found and set aside, in the foundation depths that go deeper than necessary, in the grade relationships that do not quite match the intended designs. Somewhere under Washington Street, under Beacon Street, under the cobblestones of the North End, under the filled land of the Back Bay, under Copley Square and the great filled territory, where the tidal flats used to be, the answer is down there, and on nights like this one, in the quiet between sleeping and waking, when the ordinary certainties of the daylight world have loosened their grip and the deeper questions can move freely, you can almost feel it, the presence of the buried world, the weight of the layers, the patient, underground persistence of what came before. Almost. Sleep takes you before you can reach it. Sleep is kind that way. It does not let you grasp the buried thing. It lets you rest instead. It holds the questions for you while you recover the strength to carry them through another day. The buried city waits. It has waited this long. It will wait a little more. Good night, Boston. Good night to whatever lies beneath you. Good night to the questions that your buried past raises. Good night to the curiosity that keeps people returning to those questions, night after night, documentary after documentary, asking the thing that the daylight hours are too busy to ask. What really happened here? The silence that follows that question is not empty. It is full, full of the weight of the buried world, full of the patience of things that have been underground for a very long time, full of the possibility that the question will, one day, find an answer. That day has not yet come, but the night is long, and you are here. And the buried city of Boston is waiting, 15 feet below the modern streets, in the dark and the quiet, for the moment when someone decides it is worth the effort to truly look. Until that moment, we have these questions. We have this darkness. We have the slow breath of approaching sleep and the images that drift through the mind in that border territory between waking and dreaming. Streets above buildings. Buildings below streets. Foundations deeper than they need to be. Grade relationships that do not quite match the intended designs. Photographs that show things that should not be visible. Accounts from workers who found things that should not have been there. Maps that tell a story that does not quite match the story the streets tell today. Boston, layered and complicated and partially buried and partially understood. A city with a famous past and a buried one. A city that is honest about some of its layers and silent about others. You carry it with you now, into the dark. The question of what is really under those streets. The possibility that the history we have been given is not the whole history. The image of a buried city, quiet and patient and deep, existing in the dark beneath the noise and light of the living city above. That image will be there when you wake, and you can decide in the daylight what to make of it. But for now, sleep. The buried city is not going anywhere. The questions will be waiting, the evidence will be there, and so will you, rested and ready to carry the questions into another day. sleep well. There is something that we have not yet addressed in this documentary. Something that sits at the edge of the physical evidence and the archival evidence and the architectural analysis. In the space where all of those forms of evidence point in the same direction, but where none of them quite reaches, it is the question of memory. Human beings carry the past in ways that are not always legible as history, in stories, in habits, in the particular way that a culture relates to the ground beneath its feet, in what gets celebrated and what gets avoided, in the architecture of ritual and the architecture of buildings, and in the ways that those two architectures sometimes mirror each other in ways that are difficult to explain. Boston is a city with an intense relationship to its own past, unusual even among American cities, which tend toward a more forward-looking orientation. Boston is the city that preserved the old State House when every practical consideration argued for its demolition. That preserved Faneuil Hall and the Old South Meeting House and the Paul Revere House. That created the Freedom Trail, a physical path through the city connecting the sites of its revolutionary history, as if the city understood that its identity was inseparable from the specific places where its defining moments occurred. This preservation instinct is often explained in terms of civic pride, of regional identity, of the New England character that values the old and distrusts the new. And these explanations are accurate as far as they go. But the mudflood researchers point to something else in Boston's preservation culture. They point to the intensity of the attachment to specific sites, to the way that certain locations in the city carry a weight of meaning that exceeds what the documented historical events that occurred there would seem to justify. The Old North Church is a good example. By any objective measure, it is a modestly sized colonial church building. Its architectural significance is real, but not exceptional. What gives it its extraordinary cultural weight is not primarily its architecture, but its role in the Revere story, in the story of the lanterns and the midnight ride and the beginning of the revolution. A story that locates this particular building at the origin point of American nationhood. Why this building? Why this location? Why do the stories that define American identity cluster around specific places in Boston, with a density that goes beyond what chance would predict? The mudflood researchers offer an interesting interpretation. They suggest that the preservation of certain sites, the elevation of certain locations to the status of sacred ground, is not purely the result of the documented historical events that occurred there. That the choice of which events to remember and which sites to commemorate is shaped, in ways that operate below the level of conscious decision, by something older, by the prior significance of the locations themselves. In this interpretation, the sites that Boston has chosen to remember are sites that were significant before the events that are now associated with them. The sites carry an older weight, an older meaning that was not erased by the mud, or the fill, or the street raising, or the passage of time. And the people who chose which events to commemorate and which sites to preserve were responding, without knowing it, to that older significance. This is a speculative idea. It is the kind of idea that appeals to people who think in terms of cultural memory and place attachment, and that seems less compelling to people who think in more strictly empirical terms. We are not endorsing it. We are presenting it as one of the ideas that the mudflood community generates in its effort to understand the full scope of what may have been lost and what may have been preserved. What can be said with more confidence is this: Boston's relationship to its own buried past is complicated by the same forces that complicate the relationship of any living city to what lies beneath it. The pressure of practical need, the cost of investigation, the institutional tendency to focus on what is above ground and visible rather than what is below ground and hidden. The cultural tendency to tell the story of progress and achievement rather than the story of loss and burial. These forces are not conspiratorial. They are the ordinary forces of institutional and cultural life. They do not require a deliberate suppression of evidence. They operate through the accumulation of small decisions, each individually reasonable, that collectively result in certain questions not being asked and certain evidence not being examined. The buried city of Boston exists in the space created by those accumulated small decisions. It is not actively hidden. It is simply not the subject of the focused attention that would be required to understand it fully, and so it waits, as it has waited for all the decades and centuries since whatever happened, happened. We want to spend the final portion of this documentary with the water, because Boston's relationship to water is fundamental to everything we have been discussing. The city is, at its origin, a peninsula. It is surrounded on three sides by water. Its economy, through most of its history, was built on maritime trade. Its physical expansion was accomplished by filling water. Its streets are, in part, raised to manage water. Water is everywhere in the Boston story, and the mudflood hypothesis is, at its core, a story about water, about what water can do to human settlements when it arrives in volumes and with a force that exceeds what the settlements were designed to manage. The harbour of Boston is one of the most historically important bodies of water in North America. It was the harbour that made Boston the dominant port of the colonial era. It was the harbour into which 3 shiploads of East India Company tea were dumped in December of 1773. It was the harbour from which the British fleet departed after the siege of 1776, never to return. It is also, in the geological record, a harbour that has been significantly altered from its original form. The shoreline that exists today is not the shoreline that existed when the first European settlers arrived. It is not even the shoreline that existed when the indigenous people of the region first began using this harbour for fishing and transport and trade. The shoreline has moved, dramatically, through a combination of natural processes and human intervention. The mudflood researchers are interested in the shoreline, not only as a product of gradual natural change and deliberate human filling, but as a possible record of something more dramatic. Because shorelines are sensitive archives, they record the history of the water that has acted on them. They carry evidence of storm surges and flood events and changes in sea level and depositional episodes that left their marks in the sediment. The sediment cores taken from Boston Harbour tell a story of repeated depositional events. Events in which significant amounts of material were moved by water and deposited in the harbour. The routine interpretation of these events is in terms of normal coastal processes, of storms and tidal action and the natural dynamics of an estuarine environment. But the mudflood researchers look at the same sediment cores and see evidence of events that are not within the range of normal coastal dynamics. Events characterized by a volume and a particle size distribution and a spatial extent that suggests something more energetic than a typical storm surge. Events that would, in their interpretation, be consistent with a large-scale flood carrying significant sediment load across a wide geographic area. The mainstream geologists who have studied the sediment cores do not agree with this interpretation. They find the depositional record consistent with the range of natural coastal events that would be expected over the historical period in question. They do not find evidence of the kind of extraordinary event that the mudflood hypothesis requires, but the discussion continues. The same evidence, read differently, the same cores interpreted within different frameworks, the same sediment, carrying different stories depending on the assumptions of the person reading it. This is the fundamental condition of the mudflood inquiry, not a simple confrontation between evidence and no evidence, but a confrontation between different interpretations of the same evidence, between different frameworks for understanding what the physical record means. In that confrontation, the Boston Harbour sediment is one of the most interesting arenas, because the harbour is where the water meets the land, where the boundary between the two elements is drawn and redrawn by the forces that act on both, where the story of the city's relationship to water and to whatever happened to it in the relatively recent past is most legibly written. If you could lower yourself to the bottom of Boston Harbor tonight, if you could settle into the sediment and let the layers accumulate around you, let the history compress into the mud beneath you, you would be lying in the physical record of everything that has happened at this place. The glacial retreat, the slow rise of sea level after the ice, the millennia of indigenous use, the colonial period, the revolutionary era, the great expansion of the 19th century, and whatever came before all of that, whatever the sediment covers. You cannot do that, of course. But you can imagine it, in the border territory between waking and sleeping, where the imagination operates most freely. You can let yourself drift down through the water of the harbor, through the cold and the dark, to where the sediment begins, to the soft and yielding archive of this place. What does it say? The investigation that would answer that question properly has not been done. The resources have not been committed. The institutional will has not been there. But the sediment is there, patient and dark and full of the record of everything that has happened here. It will be there in the morning, when the harbour ferries begin their runs and the fishing boats go out and the tourist vessels load their passengers for the tour of the harbour islands. The sediment will be there, under all of that activity, holding its archive, waiting for the question to be properly asked. Boston, a city with layers, a city built on something that is still there, under the streets and under the harbour and under the filled land and under the cut hills and under the raised streets and under the foundations that go deeper than they need to go. Under all of it, still there, still waiting. You are almost asleep now. The words have become part of the dark. The city of Boston has become part of the dark. The buried city has become part of the dark. Everything is dark and quiet and still. Beneath the modern city, in the dark and the soil and the clay, the buried past continues its patient existence. The timber structures that workers found, the stone foundations in unexpected places, the artifacts of a previous world, the grade relationships that do not quite match the intended designs. All of it there, all of it quiet, all of it part of the accumulated mystery of this place that calls itself the cradle of liberty and that sits on a buried world that it has not yet fully examined. The cradle of liberty sits on a buried city, and the buried city carries questions that the cradle has not yet answered. Sleep now. Carry the questions with you into the dark. Let them settle into the quiet of your sleeping mind. They will be there in the morning, gentle and patient, like all things that have been underground for a very long time. The buried city of Boston wishes you a good night, and it will be here, when you return, with its silence and its grade anomalies and its deep foundations and its harbour sediment and its complicated layered past, waiting for the day when someone decides it is truly worth the effort to go all the way down. All the way down to where the old things are. All the way down to where the answers live. All the way down to where the buried city waits in the dark. Patient as stone, patient as clay, patient as everything that has survived by being hidden, by being below the level of ordinary attention, by being deeper than the surface story goes, deeper than the streets, deeper than the fill, deeper than the cut hills and the raised grades and the documented history. Down there in the dark where Boston keeps its oldest secrets. Down there where you are going now as sleep takes you. Down into the quiet. Down into the dark. Down into the long, patient night that holds everything that has been buried and everything that has been forgotten and everything that is waiting, still to be found. Good night.